Cool. So the last thing I wanted to talk to you about, Cameron, was I want to go through and just quickly talk about like how to think about identifying opportunities for agentic applications. I think it could be worthwhile just spending a bit of time talking through those things. And I've got 2 data sets that I think can be helpful. I'd be interested for people to play with them. I think you would love diving into this data. But the reason why I think it's important is because we have seen agentic kind of workflows be adopted in certain industries a lot, right? The first domino to fall was effectively coding at the higher end of the wage curve and the more complicated area of sort of like application. And the lower area were things like digital, online, or phone-based customer support. And one of the reasons for that is because it was a very deterministic kind of outcome, like the code runs or it doesn't. The customer has their problem solved or they don't. And those 2 areas sort of fallen. But next, like what we're all kind of looking for, like, well, what are the next areas where agentic applications will really like make a massive difference and be adopted in a wide scale way? And also, if you are working, so there's 2 ways to think about this. Like if you're an entrepreneur thinking about where you should start a business, or if you're someone who's deploying capital thinking about how you should do that, that's one area. And, that's like a reason why you need to think about this. But also if you're people like us, you're working in bigger companies, or if you're thinking of going and working somewhere, or if you're tasked with sort of adopting AI through your organization, like how should you think about it? How should you think about getting the most effective outcome of like output of an agentic system? That's another reason why I think it's important. So it's not just like for startups, building startups, it's also for just regular people like us, regular folks. So that's why I wanted to have a chat with you about it. Is this something that you've thought about much, or like when you talk to people about how to build these systems, like, is it?
Yeah, of course. And the first place my mind goes is almost like the hype. And you kind of get in trouble when you start using these buzzwords so often, because now you have everybody is like, I need agents. And then in a lot of cases, maybe it's just a simple workflow automation that doesn't use AI at all. Right. So I think that's the challenge, is determining what is truly agentic and where does it actually fit. Because we talked about, like, you have to control yourself a little bit with all these amazing technologies that are coming out. If you're like us, you just want to run to it and say, oh yeah, this is the answer, let's do this. But um that's fine personally, but in a business environment, not how you go about it, right?
Yeah. I think there is some evidence, and I saw some of that recently, that some of the enterprise investment is slowing down in AI. I think a lot of CIOs, CTOs must have gotten burnt in the first kind of year or 2 when they spent a bunch of cash and none of it really occurred, which is the classic, trough of disillusionment kind of space. But in this domain, I think the tools have accelerated ahead in the agentic space, and then big companies like Salesforce are getting behind it, right? What I want to do is sort of lay out a framework where people can think about, what is it? Is it possible? What can I expect? And then how to go about building an agentic application to validate my hypothesis in this space, so that you can do it with relatively low risk and also identify the right areas within an organization to attack. So what I want to do to use to do that is there's a couple of different data sets. The 2 main ones that I want to talk through with you are, there's a piece of work that was done by A16 and Z a while back on their enterprise team, where they went through and I always mispronounce this, is the NAICS code analysis. That's like a US government census kind of analysis of different industries, as a basic way to frame up the market, which is basically to say, like, for an agentic application which has semi-autonomous or completely autonomous kind of elements to it enabled by AI, what are the target industries, target activities, target areas, and what's the size of the prize? Like, what are you actually talking about in terms of either optimizing operational expense or expanding the team for those businesses so they can go and steal share off their competitors? That's sort of the reason. That's how how I think about it anyway. And then you can use data like that, which I'll show you in a second, to kind of understand what kind of application you should deploy, whether it should be fully autonomous down in one end or more of a augmented kind of implementation based on how complex the tasks are, based on the nature of the people who work in those roles in those businesses. And then on top of that, the Anthropic AI Economic Impact Index project is really good for this because they take it from the other path, which is basically they say, well, everyone's using AI and they've open sourced or published on Hugging Face the data set around, the analysis they did on about 1 million chat conversations. And then they identified all of the kinds of tasks those people were interacting on the basis of, the engagement that they had in that chat. And then they tried to align that with these US Department of Labor definitions of tasks and occupations that match them. So you can get a sense of like, well, what's the adoption rate in certain occupations for AI engagement in a chat interface? And then you can look at it and go, well, if I can elevate components of that into an agentic application, then I've got a degree of adoption pattern within those roles already. So that's more at the role level. And I think with those two data sets, you could basically start building a picture of like, well, in this industry, this is the size of the prize, this is the kind of app. In this industry, these kinds of roles, all right, and how are those people actually using AI? So you can match it up pretty well. I haven't done all of that matching here, but I've got a few things I want to talk you through. I reckon if we publish it, like they would publish this so that other researchers could do this work, and there are a lot of other researchers in there. But I think for us, it's an interesting data set to dive into, to play with. So this is, the A16Z article. It came out a while ago now, so it's not particularly that's sort of almost 6 months ago. But basically, they tried to take the approach of looking at areas where AI systems will take up the slack in the labor market. The primary thing that they used was this data set here, which is basically a code level analysis of companies in this kind of code. So in this, petroleum and petrol product merchant wholesalers, how many firms are there? What's the total sales rate? How many employees are there, and what's the revenue per employee? Which can give you a benchmark of what the kind of AI applications they use. That would be suitable for that kind of cohort, and then the total size of the prize in terms of the payoff and the number of firms you have to sell to. So, for example, monetary authorities like central banks, there's 12. There's only 12. As defined by them, petroleum refineries, there's only 65. Whereas car wholesalers, there's 5,000 in this economic environment, which is North America, defined as America. But I find it interesting to visualize this kind of data to sort of analyze this. So what I might do is show you this set here. So when you actually stack it up this is like a Tableau. Do you use Tableau at all for data stuff?
I used to, not as much lately.
So if you want to dive into this, you can. I'll publish this on Tableau, public cloud, but then also the Anthropic data set is a Jupyter notebook. You can recreate how they do their analysis. But this gives you a sense of each of these things. So on the bottom here is the total number of firms in the market. On this axis is basically the revenue per employee. And so the A16 and Z guys were saying revenue per employee kind of denotes more Copilot style implementations occur up here.
Mm-hmm.
Down here, it's more automation standards. So for example, in healthcare and social assistance work, you want to implement more automation tooling, because the prioritization of organizations within that cohort is more about efficiency gains within their existing workforce, as in replacement or automation. Whereas up here, it's more about augmentation and getting more out of the people with the expertise if the revenue number is higher per employee. That's their analysis. So it's a good way to look at the kinds of AI tooling and agentic applications to implement by sector, and then also just how much is there. So for example, wholesale trade, that's a very large market, right? That's a top level group. It's a bit probably better just to look at it by individual industries. So these are all of the individual, subsectors types, and you can see the kinds of. I've changed up the axis a little bit for you, but you can see it here.
So the data set, it's really just the raw NAICS data, or did they provide a layer of analysis?
I think they did the revenue per employee component. I don't know. It's not every code is in there. But it's basically just it's a shorthand way. If you were going to do a process like this, that was really in depth, you'd get more of the data out, right? And this is just what they published on that blog post. But it's basically just what's the concentration rate? How many firms are there? How much do they sell? And then money per employee. Thinking about like the kinds of things. So this is the construction domain, or you can go into education, for example. If you're education, these are the individual kinds of education institutions within the education sector. So what I was showing you before is the total number, whereas this is the actual individual area. And then the revenue per employee, what you're trying to get to, and then the total value of the sales and the value of sales on the right-hand side. I actually made the size, the actual number of employees here. So technical and trade schools was a classic one, or educational support services. It's about a $16 billion industry. Revenue per employee is about $158,000 a year per employee. But the total number is really high, right? So if you can implement agentic applications into that specific segment and either reduce the total number of required employees or increase their productivity via automation, then within those firms, they could either capture more share, and there's about 8,000 of them in the market right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it's an interesting tool to use. It's like, all right, well, it also gives number one, it's an interesting tool to use in terms of like trying to understand, all right, where you sit and what's the opportunity for you when you think about agentic applications. Just that it also just opens up the aperture for me in terms of like if software really is going to be services, like that's where we're going, then the aperture of opportunity for building these kinds of applications is really mind-bendingly large when you look at these things, right? Because software can now do, and it is going to be doing more of the work that people have historically been doing. And behind every single one of those bubbles is a multi-billion-dollar market with all sorts of opportunities for people building agentic applications. That's the other thing that I find exciting about it. Do you have any questions on that? And then I'll talk through the anthropic.
Yeah, I guess. So this is like revenue and employee count is essentially what this data consists of.
Total value of sales. Yeah, total revenue. I think this is a few years old now, so it's like 2020 data. Revenue per employee on the vertical, and then number of employees as the size. So, and it's a logarithmic scale because you look at like restaurants is absolutely enormous. The next part of the analysis is where we can identify like, well, what are the more suitable tasks and roles in these different segments to take on with agentic workflows. So for example, thinking about agentic applications that are industry specific is one thing, but then how do you create, or you can go the other way, which is creating a horizontal strategy where your agentic workflow picks up specific components of an activity within all of these organizations or within a cohort of organizations. Mm-hmm. That might be, for example, Toast is a classic business that's out there that's picked up payments, bookings, etc. for restaurants.
Right. Well, this is amazing. It's pretty high level, but it tells a story and it gives you something to start with to dive in. So from my position, like I always want to know about IT, just technology maturity of an organization, right? So even within each one of those dots, there are going to be massive ranges of organizations that are like pen and paper today versus they already have some type of system deployed, and that's going to be a much different situation for those organizations. So on this map, they sit in the same spot, but there's like so much variety under each one of those.
It also gives you there's a lot of variety. It also gives you a sense of the, if I go to this one, which is showing like number of firms as well on the bottom here, number of firms and median revenue per employee. It also gives you a sense of the go-to-market strategy you're going to have to take, mm-hmm. because it would necessitate you building agentic workflows and systems that are highly customized and tailored when the number of firms is concentrated, because your sales motion will be an enterprise motion, as opposed to any execution that occurs down in, say, this quadrant down here where the median revenue per employee is low and the number of firms is incredibly high. Then that's where vertical-centric businesses will probably just emerge around agents that are targeted at those industries. And obviously we're seeing a lot of those, like, whether it's an industry-specific one or a task-specific one like Sierra, you would then expect those firms to target those and go horizontal and actually just go into the vertical. So you should probably, well, it depends on what you're comfortable with. Whereas my experience, I'm much more comfortable in the enterprise domain. So targeting specific ones. So the industry that I work in now, for example, real estate, if I just go real estate, well, it's real estate and finance is here. So it's sort of middle of the pack, right? But then the subsector, which my company targets, is in the appraisal and valuation domain, and their actual median revenue per employee is actually significantly higher because it's a qualified skill. Like you need a specific qualification for it. And so therefore it's much more, and this is played out with our execution of agentic kind of workflows, it's played out, it's much more copilot augmentation related. It's much more effective for that. Cool. I'll publish this and you can play with it. You can try it out.
Cool. The Tableau dashboard.
Yeah. You can try it. The next thing I want to show you is, all right, thinking about so that's like top down. Where should you actually attack the market from a sector perspective? This work from Anthropic around their economic index. Did you read this paper? I know I referenced it a while back. It's quite interesting because it takes the bottoms up approach, which is, all right, for their usage patterns, what are the top titles of people who are using Claude day to day? And what are the top tasks that they're executing on, right? And as we would see, it makes perfect sense, particularly with Anthropic, that developers are the dominant community within there. Did you dive into this research much?
It's been, I read it when it came out, but I don't remember. This is really good to recap a few months down the road, especially with the tie-in.
Yeah. So the couple of things I want to highlight. So there's the blog posts and things on their website. Then there's this Anthropic economic index data set where they publish all of the data within it. It's anonymized data around the tasks that they perform. And then they updated this recently, the data set, with clusters of task types and the description of what they're actually trying to achieve when they're trying to go through using the chat within Claude to actually execute a task, which then gives you more color and richness over the top of those individual tasks and buckets of tasks. So you can see, all right, well, what was the end state goal and what's the higher level kind of, what's the higher level outcome that the user is pushing towards? So that's number 2, which they recently released in this data set here, which I'll show you is here. Cluster level data, just here. And that's fascinating because it gives you that higher level understanding. But then beneath each of those, they also published the percentage of that task when it appears in the data set, the percentage of interaction around augmentation or automation that occurs. So you can actually dive into the data to figure out, all right, for this specific task, how much of, I'll come back to that one, how much of that user's interaction was basically focused, here it is. How much of that for that particular task and that group of tasks that a Claude user comes to Anthropic for, how much of it was focused on automations? And an example here is all right, format this technical documentation for me in Markdown. It's I want you to do this. I'm not really involved. And then they've given you a percentage score across all of those task types that people come to Claude for and the groupings between automation requests versus augmentation requests, where, all right, let's draft this together, but I want to be in the loop. And so that can guide your thinking around, all right, if I want to attack a certain market segment, or if I am in a certain domain and I want to create agentic applications, you can break down the individual tasks and you can actually see the distribution set of augmentation versus automation to guide your thinking around product design when you're thinking about building an agent system, which I thought was fascinating. And all of this has been published, so you can just dive into the data set right now. So what I'm hoping to do with this, and then I can share some of these other Tableau dashboards, is you can marry up the two. You can say, right, well, this is the area I want to go into, or I want to match up, say, two industries within that data set. What are the kind of roles? What are the kind of tasks they do? And what's the distribution of augmentation versus automation requests that they make? And then they also break it down between the kinds of augmentation versus the kinds of automation tasks. So directive, format this for me. I'm not going to ask you anymore. or an automation task where there's a feedback loop. Format this and then come back to me, because I'm then going to give you further instruction. And that's then going to be an automation loop. And that can inform the kinds of agent design patterns that you put into place for a certain kind of industry. Because you could say, all right, well, for this part, like just like what you were just showing with LangGraph, have an agent design pattern around these tasks that hands off to an agent design pattern around these tasks, which are still part of what that person does day to day. But I know when they need to be involved, or at least I've got a clue, I've got a signal to say I need to get the human involved here. And then you've got a place to drive off from to iterate and build your MVP, right? It's an amazing resource when you consider that they've just made this free and open out there.
Yeah, it makes me reminds me of like mapping tools and design patterns essentially to like similar data like this. But it would be interesting to take, because that's essentially what you're saying is you can break down the types of tasks and then take it even a step further. Okay, what tools do you need to do those tasks? And um, I won't give away too much. I've worked on that actually quite a bit. So I think you're spot on. Like this provides a lot of insights and it informs the way that you go about this. I'm really interested to go back and check this out.
At least it's a starting point, right? Because like we all know that this is just the start. Like as soon as you dive into a job that someone does, like it is way more complicated than anyone really describes on a piece of paper. You know, it always is. There's always nuance. There's always, you know, pattern recognition. There's all sorts of things in there. But at least it gives you a clue. The other thing that I thought was cool about this is this adoption pattern across occupations. So this is just a graph, which is like, all right, at the point, like 4% of occupations have 75% of the related tasks that they do at a high level definition automated to some degree within their data set, just around chat. And then you go up the adoption curve. Now you can read this in two different ways. Like you could either start here and say, well, I'm just going to enter this domain and look at the occupations that have this high penetration rate. Or you can dive into this data and actually say, well, this occupation here has 25% of their tasks automated, but that may only be because no one has built like the correct integrations for the tools that they need in order to augment more. But at least it gives you a signal that those occupations have a propensity to use AI tools, and they're in that space. So, you know, just picking one here and driving them up the adoption curve may be the correct strategy. Another one might be, all right, taking an occupation up here that has a really high propensity to use the task and giving them another occupation that's completely automated. So we all know that, like, you know, there are things that a certain profession does that bleed over into other people's profession. Like if you're a developer, you've probably got a little bit of design chops, or you've worked in that space. Or if you're an accountant, you probably do tax planning to an extent, but it's not your main game, right? So could you get an occupation up here and then automate with an agentic workflow and an agentic application, like to an extent, 80% of the way, something adjacent to what they do anyway, so that they don't have to then go and buy that service? I think that's also another kind of interesting strategy when you look at this data. Yeah. And to give it a bit of color of what it actually looks like, this is a bit of a cluster, but you can see these are the clusters of high-level clusters is what they call it in the data set. So this is the top one. Well, this is probably better. Configure, this is like the high-level kind of clustering that they've grouped using LLMs, like configure and troubleshoot, they couldn't have made that sentence more boring, but you know what it is. And then there's a subcluster underneath that of configure and optimize Docker containers and orchestrate, which is the bane of a lot of deployment engineers' existence. And then here is like two subclusters underneath those things. And then the individual tasks that are aligned to this ONET task classification system, where basically the Department of Labor Statistics goes out and tries to classify every single job with a set of tasks, which is just a high level abstraction, right? It's not a practical, but it gives you a sense of that. But this is where it gets interesting because that gives you that's 20% of records in the Claude data set of 1 million conversations. So of 1 million conversations, 200,000 of them had components of that task embedded within them. That's where it gets pretty interesting. And then underneath that, so yeah, you can actually dive into all of these and filter it, and filter it by occupation type, for example. But where it gets more interesting is you can see, all right, what's the percentage? And obviously this is not presented at a visual level, but you could see, all right, well, for this one, create and improve brand visuals. That's like a creative task. Then there's the cluster underneath that here. There's this, like the second cluster in the tasks, but it actually gives you for each of those the aggregate percentage of those tasks that were collaborative learning in process, like learning in nature. So for those tasks, what percentage of Claude conversations were about the user wanting to be taught the concept? Then what percentage were, collaborative in nature, but based on iteration? Like, was it a back and forth? Was it a turn-based thing, iteratively, like go back, come and, do this and then come back? Or like directive amount, like I was talking about before, very small number was based on this, feedback ratio. They also have a thinking ratio. So you can stack rank tasks that Claude uses based on a thinking quotient. So you can see like what are the harder tasks people are asking for, which is quite cool, and get fine grained around. That might be just as simple as just creating agentic applications just on really, really hard tasks for different user types, validation, and then you can see the total percentage rate. So I think it's a really good sort of marrying up those two things. Yeah, dive into it. I think it's worthwhile.
I'd mentioned like batch jobs and potential cost savings and things like that. Did you see anything in this data that would inform when you might consider running like batch jobs versus
No, is the short answer. I haven't, like, I don't think it's categorized like that. They anonymize the data, and I don't think they release a bunch of things around like when, how many, how often, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, sorry,
But I think
just
you could get a sense of
put you on the spot there, but that's what I was thinking
Yeah, no,
about.
that's an interesting question. I think probably the answer to that question would come in the percentage amount of the total percentage distribution of automation versus augmentation, right? You could get that, you could infer that from there.
Yeah, right.
Because they cite that in the blog post and also in the research, which is like, total percentage distribution between augmentation and here, directive or automation tasks. If you aggregate that up across a large organization, then there would be a lot of those tasks being triggered at any one time. That's that whole ambient agent thing, which is like, it's like just rather than optimizing, because this is all chat interface, right? Rather than optimizing for a person having to go to a chat and put something in, that is just a directive automation task. You have that built into some sort of trigger where an agent executes and comes back to you. Yeah. So I reckon the answer to that question would be in the tasks that have that higher percentage of directive automation workflow on them.
Wait, and I know you said it. This is data only based on the usage of Claude Desktop, or does this include API?
Just Claude, Claude Desktop or Claude Web.
Which makes sense. I mean, on the API side, it'd be like through the roof on development.
Yeah, through the roof on coding. The other factor is, and they acknowledge this in the paper, they're like, look, this isn't a representative study in terms of like the task, but it is representative of how people are actually trying to get shit done with AI, which is why I think it's helpful if you're trying to build applications. Like you can say, oh, like, this is what we think it's going to go, but this is what's actually happening today. Whereas like, if you want to build an agentic application today, I think this is a helpful kind of guidance data set. And they also acknowledge that because it's free and pro users, but it's not 100% representative of business users so much so, but they do try, and they talk about it in their methodology. They tried to reconcile those things and did some cross checks to see, like, does this person ask you about nutrition? Actually, are they a nutritionist? Not all the time, but they then say, well, or they infer that often when they did the investigation, the people in those professions were having similar conversations to the people who weren't anyway. But also for our purposes, if you're trying to build applications, it doesn't really matter because someone's trying to solve a problem. Like part of the agentic workflow or part of the promise of agentic systems is like, I don't need to go to a nutritionist. I've got an agentic nutritionist, right?
Yeah.
So it's also relevant. Yeah. But I think it's worth spending more time in here. Yeah. At least when I was diving into there. Some of the, as well as going through here, some of the areas, like I think I've spoken about a lot, a few of the ideas when I was like, well, how should I think about like building agentic systems either in my current job or like, if there's market opportunities to be, to go and look at. I think that high adoption category is good because there is still a lot of space to build better agents with the people who are more predisposed to using AI tools, which is like the Google search strategy, which is like, all right, Google wasn't the first to search, but they were the last. Just going into a place where there's an nascent and emergent piece of technology with a lot of adoption and just really nailing one use case. For example, really nailing, and I know there are platforms out there doing this, but really nailing the data scientist use case in the way that Cursor is sort of dominating, right? And I know Hex is out there. There's a bunch of tools. Like that's an example because they are way up in the adoption curve. Is an example, and you could go across all sorts of categories to try and do that. I think that idea of just giving people an augmentation to their existing business that I was mentioning before is a really good idea because you could potentially get them to provide a adjacent service for cents on the dollar if they're only needing to go halfway up there. And that could unlock, rather than destroying categories, I reckon that could actually unlock more opportunity because it would mean that more people, more businesses are willing to engage with a service and offer it to a different price point, which would open up new customer sets. Yeah.
Man,
and
I
then
learned, or I remember, like, I read the paper, checked out the data set, but not necessarily in the same way that you were talking through it. So now, of course, now I have homework. Thanks, Tom.
and the only other, I'll stop sharing my screen. The only other thing I was looking at in here was they do have a benchmark of like the barrier to entry for each of these occupations that they tag. So they basically try and, a 1 to 5 ranking. And they say like 0, like 1 is obviously like anyone can do it, no qualifications. 5 is like, a lot of qualifications. And 4 is where they see adoption really peak for Claude, but then it drops way off. Now, part of that is also because like, really high levels professionals are doctors and things like that. And there's like a physical element to it. So if you're going to execute an agentic kind of workflow on there, there's a physical component, which is sometimes hard. And it also is true at the lower end for like, very labor intensive jobs. It's just like the automation isn't as available because of the form factor. So it's not like there aren't opportunities in those places where there is low adoption. It's just the form factor would need to change for it to be injected in there. But it's definitely the prime position is in that level 4, which is like a bachelor's degree, and driving more agentic kind of applications in that domain, because that is the number one place where if you want to get access to that expertise, you still have to pay in a lot of areas. And we've seen how effective it is in, say, the coding environment for you to get some degree of outcome. And there are loads of other professions like that out there, which I think is the last kind of big area.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, not to oversimplify it, but I've said for a long time, a lot of white collar jobs are really like you take an input, you compare it or use another input, you aggregate inputs, you make a decision, and then you send an output. Like at the most simple level, that's pretty much a lot of jobs. So like, it's
that's so grim.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's dumbed down and super
Get back in your mouse
simplified,
wheel.
but yeah, it kind of goes to like if there's not a physical element required to your job, working remote, and we talk about ambient agents, right? So like it's sitting there and it reacts based on a trigger. Like the way I see it, I mean, that's a lot of jobs. Just that.
Yeah, you're right. It is a lot of jobs. But like I said, there's 2 ways to think about it. There's like the way that I was just outlining it then, which is like how people are using AI right now and how the economy is structured right now. And that's a very kind of narrow band, really, way to think about it. And then there's the completely orthogonal way to think about it, which is like there are new capabilities coming out every day and new ways to reimagine how work and the economy could be put together in this new world that we're going into, right? Which is, I think, a lot more hopeful and exciting than just like, all right, here are the components that are automated. Although on that basis, like there are a lot of things about a lot of jobs that people just like, we just don't like doing, but we have to do it because there's kind of no automated and easy way to make it happen. And I'm hoping all of these agentic systems just flood the zone in that space, which is what we're seeing, right? Like, although I am surprised that no one has destroyed PowerPoint slides yet. Like, I want someone to do that because I hate PowerPoint more than anything else.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. Really, it's the Microsoft because it's not open source, and there's very few agents and different systems that can deal with those. I
Yeah,
made
every now
some
and then in
actually.
Twitter, on X, I see like a thread going, no one's created it, and then all these people will push out like these apps. I'm like, none of those apps are replacing PowerPoint.
Right? Yeah, exactly, exactly.
All right, that's all I got, man.
I love it, man. That is seriously. Now I have to go back and I'll be finding myself knee deep in data analysis once again. I haven't done a ton of that lately. Um,
Yeah,
that's always
if you're
been
interested, I'll put up a link to the Google Colab notebook as well, and you can play with that because the Anthropic guys published the notebook, and then you can replicate their analysis in the report as well. But then they just have one you can play with too, which is a lot of fun. But I think someone
Yep.
like you probably needs to use that rather than me.
Man, well, I learned a lot. I appreciate it. And I'll talk to you next week. Always a blast.